It was just after 6 p.m. when the call came in, a tragic discovery that would shock an entire community. In a quiet apartment complex on Newberry Road, a young child had been found lifeless. Her name was Skyler, and her short life ended in unimaginable suffering. The once ordinary halls of this building now echo with sorrow, as police tape flutters in the breeze outside her family's apartment. Officers move methodically through the space, their flashlights cutting through the dim light, uncovering a scene of neglect and despair. This is not just a case of neglect. It's a harrowing tale of misplaced priorities, unchecked emotions, and the devastating consequences of choices made by those who should have protected her most. Skyler's story is one of love gone wrong, of promises broken, and of the fragile line between right and wrong that some choose to cross. If you're new here, welcome to Vic's True Crime Stories. If you want more gripping cases like this one, hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss out. It all began innocently enough. Shanel had been raising her two children, Skyler, who was just 2 years old, and her brother Jake, who was 3 years old, on her own for years, balancing the demands of motherhood with the monotony of everyday life. Then, one day, she met Brian. At first, he seemed like a breath of fresh air, a chance to break free from the isolation that often came with single parenthood. He was charming, attentive, and made her laugh in ways she hadn't in a long time. He made me feel alive, Shanel would later recall during questioning. Like I wasn't just a single mom anymore. In those early days, Shanel worked hard to maintain balance. She hired a babysitter to ensure her children were cared for while she spent time with Brian. It felt like the perfect solution. She could indulge in the excitement of their budding relationship without compromising her responsibilities as a parent. The arrangement seemed to work well at first. Skyler, at 2, and Jake at 3, loved having someone new around, and Shanel could finally enjoy some much-needed adult company. But as the weeks turned into months, cracks began to appear in what had once seemed like an ideal setup. Brian's charm started to fade, replaced by something darker. He grew increasingly possessive, demanding more and more of Shanel's attention. Their nights out became less frequent, replaced by quiet evenings at his apartment where the focus was solely on them. And then there were the arguments, the kind that left Shanel feeling torn between her love for her children and her growing attachment to Brian. One evening, after a particularly stressful week, the conversation turned to money. They were sitting in Brian's small but tidy apartment, the faint hum of traffic outside providing a backdrop to their escalating tension. Shanel mentioned casually that she needed to pay the babysitter again for the weekend, hoping it wouldn't spark another argument. But Brian's expression darkened almost immediately. "Why do we have to keep spending so much on that babysitter?" he asked sharply, his voice laced with frustration. "It's not like they're even mine. Why should I be responsible for someone else's kids?" Shanel stiffened, taken aback by the harshness in his tone. "They're my responsibility," she replied softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "But they need me too. If I don't hire someone, how am I supposed to spend time with you?" Brian leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "We can barely make ends meet as it is," he snapped. "And every time you hire that babysitter, it feels like you're throwing our money away. Do you realize how much that adds up to? You think I enjoy working overtime just to cover your expenses?" Shanel felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She knew Brian worked hard, and she hated the thought of being a burden. Still, she couldn't shake the fear of leaving her children alone. "What do you want me to do?" she asked quietly. "Just leave them by themselves?" At first, Brian didn't answer. He stared out the window, his jaw tight with resolve. Finally, he turned to her, his eyes locking onto hers. "Maybe it's time you start managing things differently," he said firmly. "You've handled everything on your own before. Why can't you do it now?" Shanel hesitated, torn between her instincts as a mother and her desire to keep Brian happy. Deep down, she knew he was right about the financial strain, but the idea of leaving Skyler and Jake alone filled her with dread. Yet, as Brian continued to pressure her, she found herself agreeing, against her better judgment, that maybe she could manage without the babysitter. After all, how bad could it really be? Gradually, Brian's words sank in, and Shanel began to cut back on hiring the babysitter. What started as occasional nights away with Brian soon stretched into entire weekends. She justified her actions by telling herself that everything would be fine, that Skyler and Jake were resilient and could go without her for a little while. But deep inside, she carried a gnawing sense of guilt, a feeling she pushed aside each time Brian whispered sweet nothings in her ear or promised her a future filled with excitement and escape. Do you think Shanel could have done things differently? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to share this video with friends who love true crime stories. As we'll soon see, these choices set off a chain reaction of events that would ultimately lead to tragedy, a stark reminder of how easily misplaced priorities can spiral out of control. As the months went by, Brian's influence over Shanel deepened, and the cracks in their household widened. The decision to stop using the babysitter marked the beginning of a downward spiral that neither could have fully anticipated. At first, Shanel convinced herself it was manageable. She'd leave Skyler, who was only 2 years old, and Jake, who was 3, for just a few hours at a time while she spent evenings with Brian. But as his demands grew, those few hours stretched into entire nights, and then weekends. Brian had been relentless in his arguments about the babysitter. "It's not worth the money," he'd say, his voice firm but laced with guilt-tripping undertones. "You've done this before on your own. Why can't you handle it now?" Each time, Shanel found herself nodding along, her resolve weakening under the weight of his persuasion. Yet deep down, she knew it wasn't right. She tried to rationalize her choices, telling herself that Skyler and Jake were strong kids, they'd be okay for a little while. But as the days turned into weeks, the reality of their neglect began to take its toll. The apartment slowly transformed into a reflection of Shanel's fractured priorities. Food became scarce. Meals turned into sporadic snacks when Shanel remembered to pick something up from the store. Cleanliness deteriorated, dishes piled up in the sink, laundry overflowed in corners, and the faint smell of mildew crept through the air. Toys lay scattered across the floor, untouched except for brief moments when Jake or Skyler wandered aimlessly around the space. There was no routine, no structure, just an overwhelming sense of abandonment. Shanel's internal conflict raged constantly. In quiet moments alone, she wrestled with her guilt. "I knew something was wrong," she would later admit during questioning. "But every time I thought about leaving him, he promised me we could make it work together." Brian's words echoed in her mind, promises of love, excitement, and escape from the monotony of single parenthood. They were intoxicating enough to blur her judgment, even as her children suffered in plain sight. Jake, at 3 years old, bore the brunt of the neglect more visibly than Skyler. His once plump cheeks grew hollow, his eyes sunken and listless. He shuffled around the apartment like an old man, his movements sluggish and uncoordinated. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, each word tinged with exhaustion. Skyler, though younger, seemed eerily aware of the situation. Her big, curious eyes followed Shanel everywhere, searching for attention that rarely came. She clung to her brother, holding his hand tightly whenever they were left alone, as if seeking comfort in the only person she trusted. Their innocence was heartbreaking. Skyler still giggled occasionally, her laughter a fleeting reminder of the child she should have been, a happy, healthy toddler exploring the world with wonder. But those moments grew fewer and farther between. Jake, meanwhile, retreated further into himself, his small frame growing increasingly frail. Their clothes hung loosely on their bodies, unwashed and threadbare, a stark contrast to the vibrant children they once were. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Shanel, Chris, the father living in Ohio, remained blissfully unaware of the dire conditions his children endured. He had relinquished custody a year earlier, trusting Shanel to provide the care and stability their family needed. Phone calls between them were infrequent, and updates about Skyler and Jake came sparingly. Chris believed everything was fine, his faith in Shanel unwavering. It wasn't until the news broke that he learned the truth, a truth so devastating it shattered his world. "I never imagined anything like this," he told authorities later, his voice trembling with grief. "I thought she loved them." The media coverage of the case quickly spiraled out of control, turning what was once a private tragedy into a public spectacle. Headlines screamed across newspapers and social media feeds. Local mother faces charges after child found dead. Community stunned by tragic death of 2-year-old. Public opinion was swift and unforgiving. Some labeled Shanel a monster, incapable of caring for her own children. Others pointed fingers at systemic failures, questioning why no one intervened sooner. Neighbors chimed in, recalling glimpses of the children through cracked windows or brief encounters in the hallway. "They always looked so dirty," one neighbor recalled. "But I didn't think much of it." Another added, "She seemed like such a nice woman. Who would have thought?" Through it all, Shanel sat silently in her cell, her mind replaying the events that led to this moment. She couldn't escape the image of Skyler lying motionless beneath the heavy dresser, her tiny body cold to the touch. Every memory of her daughter felt like a knife twisting in her chest. And yet, despite the pain, she couldn't help but wonder, if only she hadn't let Brian pressure her, if only she'd listened to her instincts, if only she'd fought harder to protect her children. What do you think drove Shanel to prioritize her relationship over her children? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. As we'll soon see, the consequences of her choices rippled far beyond the walls of that squalid apartment, touching everyone connected to Skyler and Jake's story. The day began like any other for Shanel, a haze of denial and misplaced priorities. She had spent the night at Brian's apartment, as she often did, seeking solace in his company while her children remained alone in their deteriorating home. As dawn broke, a gnawing sense of unease crept into her mind, but she pushed it aside, convincing herself that everything would be fine. When she finally returned to the apartment late Saturday evening, however, reality hit her with brutal force. At first, the scene seemed ordinary. Jake sat slumped on the floor, staring blankly ahead, too weak to acknowledge her presence. But then her eyes fell on the heavy dresser in the corner of the room. Something about its position felt off, slightly askew from where she remembered leaving it. A cold dread pooled in her stomach as she approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. With trembling hands, she pulled the dresser away, revealing Skyler's lifeless body beneath it. Her tiny frame was motionless, her skin pale and cold to the touch. For a moment, Shanel froze, unable to process what she was seeing. Denial surged through her veins. "No, this can't be happening," she whispered to herself. But deep down, she knew the truth. Panic quickly gave way to frantic action. Shanel cradled Skyler in her arms, screaming her name, shaking her gently in a desperate attempt to revive her. But it was too late. The stillness in her daughter's body told a story no mother should ever have to face. Overwhelmed by despair, Shanel collapsed to the ground, her sobs echoing through the empty apartment. In that moment, the weight of her choices crashed down upon her, crushing her with guilt and regret. As paramedics arrived, they found Jake barely conscious, his frail body a testament to the neglect he had endured. Taken to Riley Hospital, medical staff described him as on the brink of survival. His stomach was distended from prolonged hunger, his feet swollen and raw from lack of proper care. One nurse recounted the unbearable stench emanating from the family's living quarters, a result of filth, feces, rotting food, and unwashed laundry scattered throughout the space. It was clear no one had cleaned the apartment in days, perhaps even weeks. Despite his critical condition, Jake clung to life, offering a glimmer of hope amidst the tragedy. An autopsy later revealed the full extent of Skyler's suffering. Patterned bruising covered her tiny frame, evidence of repeated trauma. Bite marks marred her back, and a puncture wound on her neck suggested violent force. Hypothermia was also cited as a contributing factor. Investigators noted that the temperature inside the apartment barely reached 51 degrees Fahrenheit. These chilling details painted a harrowing picture of neglect and abuse, leaving little doubt about the circumstances surrounding her death. The legal ramifications unfolded swiftly. Shanel faced charges of neglect, enabling abuse, and manslaughter, her actions under scrutiny by both law enforcement and the public. Brian, too, came under fire, accused of assisting in the neglect and potentially enabling Shanel's behavior. During interrogations, inconsistencies in his story emerged. While he initially claimed not to have seen the children since late December, further investigation revealed that he may have been more involved than he let on. Documents suggested he knew about the dire conditions in the apartment yet chose to turn a blind eye, prioritizing his relationship with Shanel over the well-being of her children. Public reaction to the case was swift and polarizing. Headlines dominated local news outlets, sparking outrage and debate across the community. Many condemned Shanel outright, labeling her a monster incapable of caring for her own children. Others, however, expressed sympathy, acknowledging the complexities of her situation and the toxic influence of Brian. How could anyone do this to their own child? Some asked, their voices filled with disbelief. Meanwhile, neighbors chimed in with recollections of the family, painting a picture of isolation and desperation. "She always seemed so overwhelmed," one neighbor recalled. "I wish I'd done more to help." For Shanel, the world outside her cell felt distant, yet the media frenzy surrounding the case followed her relentlessly. Every headline, every comment, every judgment added another layer of pain to her already shattered psyche. As the legal proceedings commenced, she sat quietly, her eyes hollow but her mind consumed by memories of the past year, the choices she made, the promises she believed, and the devastating consequences of it all. This heartbreaking case serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of childhood and the profound impact of adult choices on innocent lives. Chris sat alone in his small Ohio apartment, the weight of the news crushing him with every passing moment. He had always trusted Shanel to care for their children, believing that she loved them as much as he did. Now, faced with the reality of Skyler's death and Jake's critical condition, he grappled with waves of grief and guilt. "How could I have been so blind?" he whispered to himself, his voice trembling. Chris replayed memories of phone calls and rare visits, searching for signs he might have missed. Had he been too trusting, too distant? The questions swirled endlessly, leaving him hollow and consumed by regret. His pain was compounded by the knowledge that he couldn't undo what had happened. Skyler was gone, her bright, innocent life extinguished far too soon. Jake, though alive, bore scars, both visible and invisible, that would haunt him for years to come. Chris vowed to fight for custody of his surviving son, determined to give him the love and stability he deserved. But even as he prepared for the legal battles ahead, he couldn't help but wonder if it was already too late to repair the damage done. As the community processed the tragedy, broader questions began to surface. Could anyone have intervened sooner? Neighbors admitted they noticed signs of neglect but hesitated to act, unsure whether their suspicions were valid or intrusive. The system, designed to protect vulnerable children, failed spectacularly in this case, a failure that demanded accountability and reform. This case also highlighted deeper societal issues. Should parents lose custody rights if they fail to protect their children, regardless of the circumstances leading to their neglect? Or is there a way to balance punishment with rehabilitation, offering support to families struggling with addiction, poverty, or toxic relationships before it's too late? These ethical dilemmas resonated beyond the courtroom, sparking heated debates among lawmakers, social workers, and concerned citizens alike. Many argued for increased funding for family services, better training for professionals who work with at-risk children, and stricter oversight of domestic situations where red flags exist. Others emphasized the importance of community involvement, urging neighbors and acquaintances to speak up when they suspect something is wrong. Skyler's story serves as a heartbreaking reminder of the fragility of childhood and the profound impact of adult choices on innocent lives. Though her life was tragically cut short, her legacy lives on through the conversations sparked by her loss, the discussions about responsibility, empathy, and the need for systemic change. Her memory challenges us all to look closer, listen harder, and act sooner when we witness signs of suffering in those around us. In the end, justice may be served in court, but true healing requires more than a verdict. It demands a collective effort to address the root causes of neglect and abuse, ensuring that no child faces the same fate as Skyler ever again. As Jake begins his long road to recovery, supported by a father desperate to make amends, the world must learn from this tragedy and commit to creating safer, more compassionate communities for every child. As the dust settles on this harrowing case, we're left with a heavy heart and profound questions about the choices that led to such a tragic outcome. If you know someone who loves true crime stories, send them the link to this video. They won't regret it. Together, let's keep sharing these important narratives so we can learn, grow, and make a difference. Thank you for watching this episode of Vic's True Crime Stories. Be sure to check out our other videos for more gripping yet thought-provoking cases. Don't forget to subscribe and enable notifications so you never miss an update. For Skyler, and for every child who deserves a chance at a brighter future.